And so I'll turn to Constance for this forward-looking discussion after the current dialogue around law enforcement and encryption. And Constance, the screen is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jaren, and thank you to the panelists from the previous session. I think it lays the ground perfectly well for our second conversation, which is going to be more about the future of encryption. How do we see this technology when it comes to the future of European Union, thinking about the impact on privacy, on business practices, and many other aspects. Encryption, I'm sure Robin had a chance to tell you, is really a priority topic for the Internet Society. We had a chance to decide that this theme would be one of our projects for over 2 years, and we're delighted to announce that we'll be continuing this effort, this investment in this very important topic in 2021, which will give us an opportunity to continue working with many of you. So we heard in the previous session that there was news with regards to encryption, especially in the European Union space. We've talked about a little bit this new interim regulation from the European Commission, and also this recent statement from the Home Affairs ministers of different member states. So really the question of legal access and whether or not we're reopening the question around encryption in the European Union is something we'd like to discuss with our distinguished panelists. And today we're privileged to have a very interesting group. We have with us Mr. Paul Nemitz, and very glad the technology allowed you to join our conversation, who is a principal advisor at DG Just at the European Commission. We will also have the member of the European Parliament, Karen Melchior, who previously worked for the Danish Foreign Ministry as a diplomat. We will also have Mr. Patrick Penninckx, and I hope I'm pronouncing this the right way, who is head of Information Society, head of the Information Society Department at the European Council, where he has been working for over 30 years now. And we will also have with us views shared from Mrs. Iverna McGowan, who is the director of the Center for Democracy and Technologies Europe Office, so CDT. CDT, who is, I would say, a partner in crime with the Internet Society, as we've launched this year a very important initiative called the Global Encryption Coalition. So we're delighted to have Iverna with us. Iverna, prior to CDT, worked for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And before that, she was with Amnesty International and the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. And last, but certainly not least, Mr. Jean-Christophe Toquin, also a very important member of the Global Encryption Coalition. Jean-Christophe is the coordinator of the Encryption Europe initiative, and he also acts as the president of the Cybersecurity and Cybercrime Advisors Network, and Mr. Toquin is attorney by profession. So we've mentioned these recent developments when it comes to the European Union's position. I would say the European Commission, the European Parliament, and then stakeholders from the European Union, including CDT, the Internet Society, and others, on the future of encryption, whether or not European actors are advocating for encryption with no exception, or do we have actually a conversation going on about possibly some limitations? And perhaps to initiate our conversation, I will ask Mr. Paul Nemitz from the European Commission to give us a bit of his views about where the European Commission stands on this important question. We know that encryption is essential to build the future of European Union online when we think about privacy, when we think about secrecy of business, of services. But at the same time, there's the conversation about prevention of crime and law enforcement. So, Mr. Nemitz, your views on behalf of the European Commission, please, about for 3-5 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Very happy to discuss with you. I think it's very important that the technical intelligentsia, the engineers, the programmers, and those who know about internet digitalization and the related technologies engage with politics. In fact, I've just published a book which is called Prinzip Mensch, Macht, Freiheit und Demokratie im Zeitalter der künstlichen Intelligenz, The Human Imperative, Power, Freedom, and Democracy in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And for this book, I counted the number of engineers who sit in parliaments, whether in the United States Congress or in the European Parliament or in the German Bundestag. And, while the power of technology, and this discussion shows it, and the power of engineers has hugely increased in society, at the same time, we see less and less people with this technical background in parliaments and actually really engaging in democratic discourse. So I very much welcome this discussion, but we have to move on from discussion to real participation in lawmaking processes. And let me also say, by way of introduction, I'm a burnt child on encryption, because when we negotiated the privacy shield at the time after the Schrems I judgment in the European Court of Justice, we actually discussed with industry whether we could limit the privacy shield to encrypted data only, saying, okay, adequacy only if the data which is transferred to the United States for processing encrypted. And there was an outcry in industry, representatives in Brussels, and they all said, oh, this is impossible, the internet would explode, and we cannot have that, and no way. And then a few weeks later, from one of the companies screaming loudest, which, by the way, was a European company, the board member came to Brussels together with the lobbyist who had been screaming about it, the board member responsible for compliance and legal and internet security issues, and said, well, we are encrypting anyway already everything. Nothing is changing. So why I'm telling this story is, we in politics and in the Commission, we really have to rely on the truthfulness of the information we get from industry, from academia, and in this case also from law enforcement. And my impression is that often in these dialogues we're not being told the full story. And this applies also to law enforcement. I mean, I have been very interested at the time in the cases on data retention, where, similar claims have been made, 80% of the cases could be solved if we would have a proper data retention directive. And I always asked, let me see the cases in which data retained really made a difference. Show me the judgments in which the judge referred to the telephony data retained. And I never got to see anything. So I think in all these directions, in the direction of academia, business, and law enforcement, the first call is, please give us information and don't expect us to just buy what you're saying in a meeting. We need to have this information documented, so that we can reach a policy which I would call a policy of practical concordance. I think that's what the Commission is aiming for. We are responsible both to deliver fundamental rights, data protection, privacy, but also to deliver good law enforcement, in particular in times of child exploitation, organized crime, and terrorism. So we need to have practical concordance of the very high public interest in law enforcement and of the fundamental right, where there's also very high public interest in data protection and privacy. And we can only do this if the engineering community does not deliver the technologies of encryption and then just lean back and say, well, this is it, and good luck with your law enforcement. I think what we need is a genuine dialogue which also shows ways, which will always be a combination between legislation and technology, to get to the practical concordance of all the public interest involved. And I think that's also, what the dialogue within the Commission is about. It's an iterative process between the different services, but in the end, I have to say what Katrin said in the first panel. We speak with one voice. I think it was a fair description of where we are going. We don't want to weaken, we don't want to see encryption weakened. We think it's a very important element of this new technological world in which without encryption, it's very easy, to just do profiling of data, to get to the information, so it's a vital part of our new communication world. But still, we must be able, on an individual order by a judge based on law, targeted on a person who is suspected of a serious crime, we must be able to get access to the communication of this person. This is also important. So we can only appeal to all those who participate in discussions like today, and especially those who know about the technologies and the means of how to work with them, to work with us to formulate both the laws, but also to provide the means to get to practical concordance of these public interests. I think this is my call in the discussion today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with everybody.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nemitz. It's very useful to have this overview of what we understand to be a pragmatic approach that the European Commission is trying to achieve, and perhaps to complement or bring an additional perspective to the discussion. Karen Melchior, who is member from the European Parliament, perhaps she could give us her take on where the European Union is heading when it comes to encryption in light of security challenges, whether or not the acceptance of, I would say, exceptions to the principle of encryption. Is this something that is becoming mainstream in the European Parliament? Is the European Parliament on the same page as the European Commission? Please, Mrs. Melchior.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. I think it's we're traveling kind of back in time. I remember reading about the crypto wars back in the 90s, and it seems like history is repeating itself. And I think we need to remember that encryption is an essential tool, and it is essential for many of us in order to have secret correspondence. And this is not only important for governments and politicians, but also to ensure the work of journalists, to make sure that they can keep the secrecy of their sources. And I fully understand the need for having a balanced approach, but I cannot really understand, and perhaps some of the other panelists can explain this to me, how we can have encryption with exceptions, because either you have encryption that works, which is end-to-end functional, or you will not have a functioning encryption. And I see if we start banning functional encryption, then we will only push the criminals to use more effective illegal forms of encryption, because they're already doing something that is illegal, and therefore only banning encryption for those of us acting within the law. And somehow I feel that if we are looking at the debate and coming up with the answer that we need to ban encryption, then we are perhaps asking the wrong question. There must be other ways that law enforcement can find the answers that they need, rather than asking for access to secret communication. Paul Nemitz mentioned the telephone data and logging of telephone data, and I would hope that the Commission would start looking at the case of Denmark, where the authorities in the Ministry of Justice has been illegally logging telephone data for a number of years now, and it's been refusing to stop this practice. There is a tendency for authorities and police enforcement to continue. And let's see if we can get the other panelist muted. That there is a tendency of asking for more and more information rather than looking at how we actually use the information that we have available. It's a little bit like looking for a needle in a haystack, and instead of looking for a magnet to find the needle, then you simply add more hay. And this should not be the approach that we take, because we do need to have efficient law enforcement and efficient ways of researching what has been going on. But I don't think that looking at banning encryption is the answer to go. If we're looking at, for example, sale of illicit goods, and also during the COVID crisis, pandemic recently, there has been very few illegal sales in Denmark because we have a requirement for our hosting company to know and keep updated the legal name and address of the person that is behind the hosting. And this has allowed them to actually keep track of what is being put on .dk websites and domains. And so I think we need to look into what are the other options rather than looking for banning of encryption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Melchior. It's interesting to hear your perspective, which is a little different from the one we just heard with the European Commission, this idea that encryption should be as a principle should not suffer any kind of exception. So definitely an interesting conversation. Perhaps Mr. Penninckx, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. This happens to me all the time with my own name, so don't hesitate to correct me. But certainly with the European Council, I imagine that the European Commission is probably your primary political and technical, if I may say, partner. And I'm sure you've had an opportunity to exchange and compare notes with European Union institutions. Where does the Council of Europe stand on this issue of encryption? How's your position evolved? We've always perceived the Council of Europe as a primary advocate of encryption. Has this position perhaps evolved a little bit over time? And do you differentiate yourself from the European Commission? Your views would be welcome. Please, Mr. Penninckx.
Thank you. I hope you can hear and see me because I had some connection problems.
Very well.
Can you see me as well?
Absolutely.
Okay, fine. I just have some connection problems myself, but in any case, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the panel. Maybe a preliminary information, that is that ISOC just recently, this week, actually signed a partnership agreement with the Council of Europe. And because we have a partnership with business, we have a partnership with internet companies and telecom companies and also their associations. And this week, we signed a partnership. So I would like to congratulate ISOC on that. Then, of course, right now we're in the midst of our debates within the Committee of Convention 108 and Convention 108 Plus. And one of the items on the agenda is profiling. And obviously, this is also closely connected to access to data which are sometimes encrypted. I think what we need to do is basically, for us as Council of Europe, encryption is the technology to keep conversation confidential and to protect individuals' privacy, hence individuals themselves in the digital age. So the Council of Europe is about protecting the individuals, not picking on or judging technology as such. Technology is a means in order to be able to connect people in a way. So the confidentiality of communication, I would say, is among the main building blocks of our societies, which until now had the highest legal protection. We had to go through judicial warrants, oversight, etc. If we break that, it will have serious consequences, I believe, in the fabric of our societies. At the same time, of course, law enforcement needs better tools, instruments, cooperation, etc., to fight against the rising horrors, I would say, in the digital space, whether that be cybercrime, hate speech, rising extremism, child abuse, grooming, malwares, ransomwares, identity thefts, misuse, political frauds, etc. So therefore, I think the debate needs to continue and needs to go on. But we also need to involve not only academics and businesses as such, but we also need to be able to involve law enforcement. I very much underscore what Paul Nemitz says about practical concordance. When I speak, and my department, the Information Society department, basically regroups several instruments of the Council of Europe in trying to protect media freedom on the one side, but also data protection, and we have Convention 108 in that, but also the Cybercrime Convention, Budapest Convention. And we are right now developing an additional protocol on access to evidence on the cloud, mutual legal assistance, cooperation with industry, with business partners in order to do so. And also right now working on artificial intelligence. But where it comes to the cooperation with the law enforcement community, I think the practical concordance is extremely important. When I speak to my colleagues of the Cybercrime Convention, very often we make the distinction between, on the one side, user data, traffic data, content data, and as mentioned in the panel before, we also have metadata and derived data. The encryption solely concerns one form of data, which is the content data. Of course, extremely important. And with your question and when I speak to law enforcement officials, they usually say, for us, what is most important is the user data and the traffic data. Content data, which has a higher level of protection, is very often only needed in other rounds of further investigation. So even when we look at law enforcement, it has to be seen within a context of human rights, the rule of law, and democratic necessity to have such instruments. And that's why the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, but also the Venice Commission, also the Parliamentary Assembly, have always been very, very clear on the need to protect the individual and to ensure that no abuse is made of anti-encryption legislation, so to say, in order to limit the rights of the individuals. For example, privacy and data protection. The right to privacy and private life is one of those core recognized internationally human rights issues, and the protection of personal data is inseparable element of that right. So the Cybercrime Convention as well does not criminalize the use of computer technology for purposes of anonymous communication. Our Venice Commission, as for example, stated that states should not interfere with the use of encryption technology. I believe that what Sophie in Feld said, we need adapted answers. We need to adapt our answers, make them sufficiently clear and complex in order to be able to respond to the realities as they are. And therefore, we need to base ourselves on the real needs and then check to which extent the anti-encryption laws or regulations need to be installed in order to keep that protection safe. I think that is the key starting point, and I will leave it at that. And our reflection, and nor the reflection of the European Court of Human Rights, has changed in this perspective. So we'll need to really look into what are the factual needs for law enforcement to go into possibilities to access content information and in which framework this needs to happen. I would leave it at that for the time being.
Thank you very much, Mr. Penninckx. I think the point you made about the importance of having a constant dialogue with stakeholders, including civil society and academia, is key, especially to nurture practical and hopefully consensus-based decisions. And perhaps this is the good time to bring in the conversation Mrs. McGowan, who is the director of the European Office for CDT. CDT is a founding partner of the Global Encryption Coalition. So could you tell us a little bit about why CDT felt the need to launch this coalition? Why was it timely? Is there some sort of threat or urgency? And of course, your perspectives on the evolution of encryption in general in Europe would be absolutely welcome. Please.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to join. And indeed, Center for Democracy and Technology, for any who are less familiar, is an advocacy organization working to protect human rights and democracy in the digital age. And I was struck by when Mr. Nemitz was speaking that I think one of the fantastic things about CDT is that we are an organization that brings together technologists, engineers, and human rights lawyers like myself to look at these issues. And it was that collective approach of the deep technical knowledge and that emphasis on democracy and human rights, which was one of the reasons that we became a founding member of the Global Coalition for Encryption. We're constantly recruiting new members from civil society and from industry as well. So do get in touch with us if you're interested. And the reason, I mean, the sense of urgency is that unfortunately we're seeing globally around the world, there's different, types and threats and arguments against encryption, which we see and believe is just a fundamental way of protecting our democratic space and dialogue. A few of the points that I will talk about that today. And it's also very important in these conversations, and I'll speak to that again in a minute, that we're also mindful of, how powerful the European Union's normative power is, the message that we send to the world, what happens in Europe, especially in other parts of the world where the rule of law would be weaker, or what implications that might have. So I'd like to maybe just start by acknowledging and thanking the European Data Protection Supervisor for his opening comments, which I think are extremely important, in particular in the context of some of the recent proposals and legislation that we have seen. And they're things that we know, obviously, the different stakeholders will take into account. So he stressed very, very clearly some of the EU law protections and how central encryption is to all of that. I wanted maybe to remind people as well in terms of the international human rights law on encryption. And of course, that means that government requests for communication should be judicially authorized, narrowly targeted, based on reasonable suspicion, necessary and proportionate. And even at that, the International UN Human Rights Committee has said that according to international human rights law, measures that would restrict the use of encryption are deeply problematic. So that's really, it's something, I mentioned that as well, because in the first panel today, people said, well, it's not just a question of the writing that the laws that we're writing in Europe. No, it's not. It's in fact, international standards and international law that are there for a very good and clear reason. In terms of the future of encryption, and we know there's a number of different pieces of legislation in Europe that are on the table now. I've listened with intent and agreed to a lot of the principles that both the previous European Commission person said here and said now in this one. At the same time, when I mentioned some of those safeguards, the precision of some of those safeguards in language, and also when looking exactly carefully at the wording of the European Data Protection Supervisor, obviously the reason that we and our civil society partners remained concerned and have written letters about these is that we're not seeing, concrete enough principles in those new proposals. And that's something that we're quite concerned about. I also echo the other speakers who've said today, and again, I'm not saying that from me as a human rights lawyer, I'm saying that from, conversations with my colleagues who are engineers and technologists. End-to-end encryption is, it's not something that you can easily break and put back together. So I would really encourage people to look at the excellent papers by Edry and others who really display and show these are the options on the table that need to be looked at to answer those very real and meaningful questions and requests by law enforcement. And maybe something else that struck me, if I may, in the first panel that Sophie Denfeld was talking about, and I know there was some discussion in the chat about whether it was anecdotal or not. I just wanted to say it was with regard to the killing of a particular journalist, but journalists in general, that globally we're in a situation where our civic space is shrinking. There has been an increased killing in human rights defenders, journalists are under threat. So we can't lose sight of that broader context of it exactly at the moment where these individuals who protect our democracy need more protection, that we would risk it in any way. And a second point, of course, in a similar vein to that, is that, globally, there's also, when you think about even what's going on in Belarus and, those people, and I say that from somebody, again, who's worked in the field in these situations and knowing how scary it is if somebody, if you're if you're at a threat of a foreign government or somebody else just for doing legitimate human rights or investigative work, and how much a safeguard that is to people doing that work. That's something that's really important. And another point is that all of the answers today that we said, it's been really clear. You need judicial oversight, you need precision. All of these things are requisite on a very clear and strong rule of law setup. We're having equally conversations about the challenges to the rule of law in some EU member states and certainly in other countries. So again, we can't have these discussions in a naive or abstract way. We have to root them firmly in the realities of the day and really ask ourselves, you know, what's at stake at a very moment where we also have challenges to the rule of law. To what extent, in you know, what implications could that have globally in terms of human rights defenders or journalists relying on the European Union to stand up for encryption, or even with our own member states, if we have questions about the independence of the judiciary, are we happy with an EU law that's going to, you know, even allow judiciary on encryption? Those are points that are really challenging for our times that I think are important to also put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. McGowan. I think that was a very clear intervention. It gives us the sense of urgency around this topic of encryption, and this idea that constantly we need to call to safeguard the principle of encryption in our dialogue with policymakers. So we've heard from intergovernmental organizations. We've heard from civil society. The United Society is part of the technical community, which is also an important actor as part of this conversation. Now I'd like to turn to one of our business representatives, colleagues, Mr. Jean-Christophe Le Toquin, who leads very important work at the European level in terms of aggregating interest and efforts on the industry side in the field of encryption. Mr. Le Toquin, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts and perhaps reactions to what you've heard from the different panelists, and maybe give us a bit of a view, a perspective of how industry is reacting to this conversation about encryption in Europe and how it may impact practices from business in Europe. Please, Mr. Le Toquin.
Thank you, Mrs. Bommelaer. Thank you for inviting us. I mean, Encryption Europe is a small initiative of bringing together 9 organizations, 9 SMEs, so companies who deliver solutions and products to help companies and people to encrypt their data and their communications. So thank you for giving a voice to industry and in particular European companies in this field. One thing I would like to stress is that I mean, it sounds logical to have an alliance of SMEs in encryption, but it's not easy at all. It was not easy to find encryption companies that were willing to talk externally. Why? I mean, I guess it has to do with the technicality of this industry. I mean, when you are into the encryption industry, you have a specific state of mind, which is not mine. I mean, I'm a lawyer by education. I'm a public affairs person by practice, and so I could see these people really, this industry struggling to have a voice. And so we could find 9 companies. This initiative, I would also want to stress, and because it's not a coincidence, probably, it is hosted in Luxembourg, a small country with a very strong legal framework to protect I mean, encryption as a fundamental right and as a business activity. And we are hosted by a public agency, actually under the Ministry of Economy, called Security Med in Luxembourg. And again, I guess this is not totally a coincidence, and we try to give a voice to this industry. To the question of this today, I mean, it was a fantastic discussion. I mean, I was very impressed by the diversity and the openness and the balance of all the speakers, and this is exactly what we are looking for. I will give you a very specific and I would say, I mean, enlightening example of where we are today. To the question, what is the future of encryption in the EU? I would say, I don't want to sound flattering, but I really mean it. I think it is here and now in this group. What I mean by this is that I don't see anywhere else in Europe, and certainly not at member state level, a quality of discussion like this, with this balance and the different perspective being provided by law enforcement and by digital rights organization. I will give you one example, and after my talk, I will send you a link on the chat so you can check by yourself. That's what I'm telling you is true. It is and gives you a distinction or comparison rather between what we have heard today, in particular from DG Home and DG Justice, so from Mrs. Bauer-Bolst and Mr. Nemitz, and what the situation we have in real life in France in this case. So 9 months ago, there was a question for a member of parliament, French parliament, to the Ministry of Interior about encryption and how to have access to communication in the course of investigations. And one sentence at the end of this very short answer, but very interesting, and this is all public, and I will send you the link from the parliament, French parliament, says in a nutshell that one way to access communication is to implement backdoors, and in discussion with the providers or the designers of communication services, and that these discussions are not public. This discussion between Ministry of Interior and the providers of communication were not public. So meaning that right now, as we speak, there are some private discussions between the French government or the French Ministry of Interior and encryption companies to implement backdoors. And what is maybe most surprising is not that they make this point and they use backdoor in English in this French text, which is interesting for a French statement. But no one really responded. No one really kind of, there was no outcry, there was no investigation or by media or by, I don't know, I mean, data protection authority or whoever. And so this gives you, I think, the sense of the very different situation we have between discussions not happening in France and certainly not publicly on this, and my organization, my initiative, is not having any discussion at the moment with the French Ministry of Interior, despite we did try to reach out to them. And what we have here, where you have DG Home, you have DG Justice coming and asking for really information, and it's really encouraging to hear Mr. Nemitz calling for getting specific information so we can really make an opinion, and all the principles elaborated by Mrs. Bauer-Bolst. I think we are very lucky in Europe to have this dialogue, and to conclude, I think we are very lucky as well on the other side to have ISOC, who have set up this together with CDT in the US, to have set up this global encryption coalition, which is for us as a small industry initiative very helpful to get a sense of what is happening in Europe and across the world on encryption. So, I mean, this dynamic situation of dialogue where we have the EU institutions being very open to express, I mean, the willingness to protect encryption and find some exceptional access, and yes, it is impossible. I would agree with Mrs. Melchior that, I mean, you can't say in one sentence, in principle, there will be a strong encryption and exceptional access. But I would also think that if we go beyond the principle and we look at specific details, service by service, and specific situation by specific situation, maybe then when we go into the details, we may find some ways to reconcile these two oppositions. So thank you, I mean, ISOC, for organizing this debate. Thank you for giving us a voice. And I will send you the link on the chat so people can compare what we heard from Mrs. Bauer-Bolst and what we hear from the French Minister of Interior today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. And I'm conscious of the time. I think we have about 5 minutes left. There's been a lot of discussion, comments, questions in the chat box. So perhaps now is the time to give the floor to participants online for the next for the remaining minutes. I think we have one question from Iverna Omeri, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, for Mr. Nemitz. And I think we have another question that's more general from Mr. Andrew Campling that perhaps each of the panelists could try to address in just a few, I would say 1 minute, ideally. Jiren, could you perhaps read the initial question we have for Mr. Nemitz?
Yes, of course. So the question was, wait, sorry. I'm trying to. Okay, is the European Commission against? Yeah, is the European Commission against the call by 5 vice countries, India and Japan, for tech firms to implement backdoors into end-to-end and device encryption?
Yeah, the answer is yes. We are not in favor of backdoors. We are not in favor of weakening encryption. We are not following what was a little bit by the moderator described, and that sounded to me like a little bit negative, a pragmatic approach. We are following a principles-based, constitutional-based, law-based approach, and we're looking at the development of jurisprudence. I mean, there are words like upload filter, encryption, data retention, anonymity, and on each of these 4 words, many think there's only one very clear answer. And this is actually a weakness of the European lawmaking system, that some of our laws in the end are made in council compositions which are only sectoral. The Council of the European Union is the only body which takes final decisions in the sectoral composition. So we have to be careful that all aspects come into the laws. And unfortunately, we have learned over decades, and member states too, that the executives and the legislative often go too far, and courts then have to annul measures which were taken to facilitate criminal law enforcement. And we have seen it, for example, on data retention. But, and that will be my last sentence, on data retention, we have just seen what I would call a relativization of the earlier judgment of the Court of Justice, because in a more recent judgment, Quadrature du Net, the Court of Justice has said there can be no general data retention, but when there is a very serious crime upcoming, very clear concerns, very clear indications, then there can be a time-limited and geographically limited data retention. And this is what practical concordance is about. And so I think we all together have to continue talking, and I'm in favor of openness on this. I don't think anything comes good from hush-hush, behind the closed door, secret conversations. But this has to be done in the open, because it's too important for democracy and fundamental rights. We must have open debates and work together to this, to come to a practical concordance, like the Court of Justice has given us now guidance on data retention. We must come to similar practical concordance on this issue of encryption as a key device for privacy and security, and on the other hand, the needs of modern, effective law enforcement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nemitz, for this clarification. Going back to the chat room, Jaren, I think we had a second question that this time perhaps we could ask all the panelists to try to address in about a minute.
Yes, let me read, because this was, do the panel agree that rather than law enforcement agencies specifying a method like a backdoor to encryption, it would be better to pose the question on how to allow those agencies to continue to do their job effectively to the tech community and to let it come up with a solution? This one is from Andrew Campling to all the speakers.
Okay, so perhaps this time we can go in reverse order and start by Mr. Le Toquin. Would you like to share a few thoughts about the question?
Yes, no, I would fully agree with this. I think to date, it's true that law enforcement agencies collect a lot of information from unencrypted communication. So if you look at the Messenger by Facebook, this system provides 15 million reports of people sharing images and videos of child abuse material, so 15 million or incidents are reported per year because this communication is not encrypted. So if this communication becomes encrypted, yes, this will be a massive loss of information for law enforcement. So this is a matter of concern for the child safety community, for sure. At the same time, there is a lot of information available on the darknet, for instance, on people trading information, which is not exploited today. So I think probably a proper discussion would be that when we start encrypting communication which are useful for the investigation of crimes online, we should, in the same movement, provide, ways to collect information, process information, which today are not used because people just don't think about this. And then I think that would help make everybody more comfortable that we are not losing access to vital information to protect children. And this discussion is not happening, and it's just about doing it. We have to be both sides, whether we are in privacy or law enforcement, that we can find new ways to exploit information, detect information, and go after criminals. There is plenty of opportunities to do a better job against the bad guys.
Thank you very much. And then I'll turn to Mrs. McGowan to share her thoughts, please.
Thank you. Well, I believe that conversation to a certain extent is ongoing in certain quarters, so we need to acknowledge that. But what I will say is I do like the framing or the idea to say that can we have the conversation to agree that we guard and safeguard end-to-end encryption, and then have a conversation about what are other ways to investigate, what are the other tools and things that we can do. I think if we separated out those 2 points, that we might actually find some more innovative and solutions to the problems that are being posed.
Thank you very much. And then we will turn to Mrs. Melchior. Mr. Penninckx unfortunately had to leave. Mrs. Melchior, please.
Thank you very much. I think it is exactly as Ms. McGowan just said. We need to look at the other means of research and then banning or breaking encryption. And I think I would like to hear what Mr. Nemitz would say is having access to reading the communication of suspected criminals, as was mentioned in his original intervention, while at the same time saying we don't want any backdoors. When we mentioned that we want to pose this question to the tech community, I think there is a danger of looking at a technical fix for societal problems. It is not a ban on encryption that will help us with better law enforcement. It is making sure that the law enforcement authorities, that they have the sufficient resources and they are organized in the best possible way, which is not the case, especially when looking at digital crimes at the moment.
Thank you very much. And then finally, we will have Mr. Nemitz to share his thoughts, and that will be the end of our session. Mr. Nemitz, please.
Well, I can only repeat. I think I was very clear. The European Commission is in favor of strong encryption. We're not in favor of backdoors. We're not in favor of banning encryption. And all these issues are not the issues on the table. What we are in favor of is practical concordance between strong protection of fundamental rights, and particular the right that by principle means of communication in free societies and democracies must be free from surveillance, and therefore strong encryption. But we must, and I fully concur with the Member of Parliament here, be able to equip our law enforcement with effective means. And this, and then there maybe we have a little bit a different view. I think, in our history of law enforcement, it has always included in individual cases based on law, and when a judge orders this in relation to an individual who is suspected of a serious crime, it has always included the ability to read letters, to read and to listen into telephone conversations. And if the result of our discussion here and the aim of this activity of encryption is to stop this, what historically has always existed, and to ban that from the world, and to take that tool away from our policemen, then we have a difference of view. We must continue to be able, in cases of very serious crime, to read content of communication and to listen into conversations, also real time, like on the telephone before. And you have to explain to us, if you say that this shouldn't be the case anymore, you have to explain to us how the police should be doing its work without this ability. And the challenge for all of us is, if you say, well, yeah, actually, we think it should be like that, then to find a way which doesn't weaken encryption. And, the fact that there isn't a solution now doesn't mean that we only make our life easy and say, now we only plead for, we call every effort to reach practical concordance a ban on encryption and a backdoor. Well, it isn't. I believe in the imagination of man, including in the imagination of engineers and programmers and those people who know about the digital. And maybe it's not only a technical solution, maybe it's a mix of technical solutions and law, but we need to continue working on this and find a solution which provides practical concordance, meaning that the public interests involved all are fully delivered to the public.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nemitz. And I'd also like to thank all our panelists today for a very interesting conversation. And with this, I'll turn it to my colleague, Jaren Unal, who will be delivering the concluding remarks. Please, Jaren.